Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm the president and editor-in-chief of Devex. I want to welcome everybody who's here in this session at the World Economic Forum's annual meeting, and everyone following us live streamed all over the world. We're really pleased to be a media partner with the forum and to help bring a topic that maybe isn't always on the agenda here at the annual meeting to this stage. We've got a room full of experts. We've got experts on this stage. We're going to have hopefully a dynamic conversation. You know, I'm wearing the SDG pin. You see this everywhere around the forum. And one of the underlying principles of the pin is leave no one behind. It's an important principle. It's also somewhat framed negatively, right? We want to make sure we're not leaving anyone behind who might be marginalized. We're actually going to take a more positive look at this today because the world has almost 500 million indigenous people living in communities all over, really all over the world. And those indigenous communities bring tremendous cultural and business expertise to the table, sometimes which is overlooked, in particular when it comes to trade. But that's less and less the case. There are real opportunities and there's actual real progress on including indigenous people and their communities and their businesses when we think about global trade. And we're going to get into that discussion today. And maybe for some at the forum and some who are following along, this may be a community or an issue that hasn't been on your radar screen. We really want to bring it there and show you what the opportunity actually is. So we've got a fantastic group of panelists who are going to help us get through the discussion today. Fawn Sharp, who's the president of the National Congress of American Indians in the United States. Aslak Holmberg, who's the president of the Sami Council in Norway. We have Damien O'Connor, the Minister of Trade and Export Growth of New Zealand. And Julio José Prado, who is the Minister of Production, Foreign Trade, Investment, and Fisheries of Ecuador. So you can see quite a diverse group from different parts of the world. We're going to see what the state of play is in different places and where we stand. Maybe I'll just start with you, if I could.
Sure.
Fawn, so as I mentioned, there is some progress on this issue. But explain why it matters. Why should we be paying attention to the idea of indigenous peoples and trade?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I think it's so important to consider the indigenous perspective. In the United States, we occupy nearly 2/3 of the landmass in the United States. It's quite significant. And throughout the world, indigenous peoples govern and oversee just precious resources. And in our governance, we bring a unique perspective, and it's a perspective that transcends generations and time, and we carry a lot of wisdom as well as vision. We look out 7 generations. And so when you bring an indigenous perspective to a business conversation, you're bringing just centuries of knowledge and wisdom and centuries of vision, and it's just so important at this critical time when we have no margin of error in contending with things like the climate crisis. No one is immune. We all have a role, and there is a significant role for indigenous peoples. And as we look on the horizon for a new economy and new opportunities, indigenous peoples not only have governing structures, but we're increasingly engaging in business and diversifying and growing our businesses. And so it is so very important at this time.
The term sustainability, of course, we hear that a lot at a session like this at the annual meeting. It's a relatively recent term in the business world, this idea that maybe we can marry our business model, our business objectives, with objectives that actually help people on the planet. That's sort of baked into many of the traditions you're talking about, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So let's take that a little bit further, and maybe we can go to you, Aslak, and just hear what are some of those assets that indigenous communities bring that might get overlooked by the broader conversations on trade?
Yeah, well, I come from the Sami indigenous people in the north of Europe, and we are a cross-border indigenous people. We live in the territories of 4 different countries. And I would say that there is a lot of interest into the Sami culture, whether we talk about the arts and the culture and music, film, perhaps some here. So in Venice Biennial there was the Sami Pavilion, and it got quite a lot of global attention. So I think there is a lot of interest towards our culture, and but also traditional handicrafts, reindeer products, Sami design. So there is a growing amount of interest, and I see a lot of potential there. But also there are challenges, like we are living in situations where the states are making the regulations, and we are in a marginalized position. We are not defining our own own ways of engaging with the market system. And because of the cross-border nature of our people, we are often confined by some regulations to the one nation state. So this is a limiting factor for example, for the Sami cultural industry. Like often it's seen that only the cultural sector within the country is considered to be the Sami market of the field, whereas if you look at the whole Sápmi, which is larger than Germany in area, and we have so much diversity and so much to offer. So what we want to highlight is that Sápmi is one market in 4 countries. And then there are the challenges with the borders, with the customs, with the value-added tax. So I think there is a lot of things to work to better to get away from these border restrictions that we have. And we are hoping to work towards getting a trade agreement that would allow Sami cultural industry, why not other industries as well, to operate within the Sami area without the harms that the borders are bringing us currently.
And the 4 countries, just for awareness, it's Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia, right?
Yes, yes.
And one of the issues we'll come back to later is this idea of protecting the cultural heritage too. It's partly, as you say, that's what there's a lot of interest in, but also ensuring that those cultural products are owned, controlled, and the benefits go back to the community and don't get picked up by others. And so there's this idea of like labeling or certification or ensuring things truly are authentic and coming from the community. Maybe that's a good segue to our minister from New Zealand. We have Damien O'Connor here, who it's a busy day for you to be on this panel. There's a lot happening in your home country, as people may know if you followed the news about the New Zealand Prime Minister. But on this topic, New Zealand, of course, has a rich cultural tradition of Indigenous people, and you've done quite a bit on this issue of Indigenous peoples and trade. So maybe just take us through why you're doing that work and a little bit of what you're doing.
I mean, we're a small nation of a few islands way down the bottom of the South Pacific, settled by Maori people hundreds of years ago. And more recently, of course, we've had settlement from Europeans. And the people in the 1800s, where there was conflict and discussion, had the wisdom to sit down and work a constitutional arrangement, a treaty between our Indigenous people and the settlers. And so that's long-standing. We haven't always implemented it in the way it was intended. And we've been working to improve that over the last 180 years. But we now have our Indigenous people, our Maori people. They're made up of different groups, but they have an asset base of $45 billion. They're a significant player in our economy. And people like myself grew up with limited knowledge of Māori culture, but we're changing that with introducing more education through our school system. I think we're interacting. We have constitutional arrangements and obligations to consult and with our Indigenous people. And that's led to a greater level of understanding, greater opportunities. And in terms of trade, we have an obligation to speak with our Māori people as we think of, develop, and then negotiate trade agreements so that there are opportunities for them to realise. They have different structures around multiple ownership of assets and land. And so the traditional finance system hasn't always helped them. So we're working to improve that. And that's what makes us a unique nation, is our Māori culture.
Just to understand that a bit more, so perhaps a Maori business person might go to a bank and say, I need a loan to start a business or grow my business, but can't provide the typical ownership of a home or of a land or other collateral because it might be community owned. Right? And so the bank might say, we can't provide financing.
It might be based, or the house might be built on community-owned land. And so it makes it more difficult for them to get the security. So we're working through and have made huge progress in that area over the last probably 30 years. And we're upholding the obligations as intended and written in 1840. So it's taken us a long time to get to the space where they are active and real partners in everything that we do in our economy.
I mentioned like cultural preservation, getting certification or branding. For those who are less familiar with some of these issues, isn't Manuka honey an example?
I mean, it's a great example of an Indigenous plant that we have. We have some discussion with Australians on that. Mm-hmm. But the point is that we're utilising that to create a high-value product. And our Māori people who are part of that industry, they want to claim rightful benefits from that in partnership with others who are utilising it.
Right, so perhaps it's an example with challenges where you can take a product, make it into a really big global business, create economic growth for everyone if you can find the right arrangement that protects the cultural heritage behind it.
In our trade agreements, more recently with the UK and the EU, they have Indigenous chapters that allow specifically for those values to be incorporated and recognised in trade between our nations.
Maybe I can turn to our minister from Ecuador, Julio. Ecuador has a large indigenous population,
Right.
a rich cultural tradition there as well. I actually studied abroad there in college, so I've had a chance to see some of that up close. How do you think about these issues in the context of Ecuador and perhaps even a little broader in the Latin American region?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you for having me here in the invitation to this non-traditional panel, which is really, really important. Just to give you a very quick background on Ecuador. So we are 18 million citizens in our country, so it's roughly a small country for Latin America, but probably between 1.3 or 2 million are indigenous people. So we are a country which has 4 different very specific regions. So first region, the coastal area, main exports from there, bananas, coffee, shrimps, fishing industry, of course. Then in the Andean part of the country, the highlands where Quito, the city capital, is located, very different type of production. So textile, superfoods, quinoa, this type of cereals are produced by the indigenous people. And then we have the rainforest, which is, of course, very well known, the rainforest in Ecuador, the Amazon, which connects to Brazil and to Colombia. And then we have the islands, which is mainly Galapagos, which is very well known. So those are 4 different regions in Ecuador. In each region, we have the presence of indigenous communities, which are recognized by our constitution. More than 20 different nationalities are recognized by our constitution, and some of those are growing by day. So I think after the pandemic, Sean Fawn is your name? Yeah. Fawn mentioned that these are very important times to have this discussion. It's always important, but after the pandemic, I think it's even more important, because we like to say that after the pandemic, we have to go back to basics in many aspects. And the indigenous people know how to understand the basic aspects of sustainability, of conservation, of how to grow products without organic, components and everything. So that, I think it's a great opportunity when we relate that to investment, to trade, to open up the economy, and to send more indigenous-based products to the world. That's something that we're trying to do in Ecuador.
So let's talk a little bit about barriers, and I'll open this up to anyone. We've heard already about borders. So when you have indigenous people that spill across nation-state borders, and those borders may, with their tariffs and customs, may create challenges for building a market. We also talked about finance. Mm-hmm. Right? What are some of the other barriers that people face, business people, when they're trying to work in these markets?
I think one of the other barriers is just understanding the nature of governance. In the United States, as well as around the world, indigenous peoples are working to advance implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's a basic concept of free, prior, and informed consent to ensure that tribal nations have a decisive say over their land, territories, resources, and people. And so I think fundamentally having an opportunity to know and engage with a tribal nation that they do possess that inherent sovereign authority to make decisions with respect to their land, territories, resources, and people.
So you feel like there are decisions otherwise that might be made elsewhere and
Yes.
come down and are imposed on communities?
And unilateral decisions, correct.
Any other barriers that people see?
I mean, I think in spite of, I guess, the long period, 180 years that we've been working on this, we've still ended up with disparities between our Indigenous people and other people across our nation. Whether it's access to tertiary education, we've been working hard on that. The capacity within our Māori business to take up all those export opportunities, has to be enhanced. And so we're working actively to overcome what are often disparities across many Indigenous peoples in many nations for many reasons, but we have to acknowledge those and then put in place some proactive initiatives to assist them to reach out and to reach up to take those opportunities that are out there in the global trade.
Yeah, and to add to Fawn's point, it is the core of our traditional economies is the land and the water, and there are definitely some legal barriers and legal insecurity that impacts our traditional economy, such as, for example, reindeer herding. And we have cases like a case in the south of southern Sami areas from Norway regarding wind power development, where the barrier was drawn by the Supreme Court of Norway, stating that this development of the largest inland wind power park in Europe to Sami lands was a breach of Sami cultural rights. And the Supreme Court actually ruled the wind power development illegal because it broke Sami cultural rights. So definitely we are working towards this legal recognition that there has to be a baseline that cannot be breached in order for our traditional economies to survive and thrive.
And Julio, what about in Ecuador? What are some of the barriers?
Yeah, well, many barriers in the indigenous areas. Well, it's social inclusion, it's financial inclusion, it's educational inclusion for the indigenous communities that is lacking in Ecuador, and of course economic inclusion broadly. So I just remember one figure that we presented last week. We presented an agribusiness strategy in Ecuador in my ministry, and one of the data points that we were making clear is that 60% of agriculture, especially in the indigenous communities, are non-paid. So the people that work there in their farms are not being paid for those products that they farm and they try to sell in the cities in Ecuador. So that's something that is a huge barrier, of course. Yeah.
Now there has been some progress on the trade agreement that New Zealand's part of in Asia. Can you talk a little bit about that trade agreement? What's the basis of it? Can it be expanded?
Look, we've just negotiated with the UK and EU trade agreements. They've included Indigenous chapters. That's reference to that. And at the start of the negotiations, it was a new concept for both the UK and for the EU, where it's more complex. Obviously, many other member countries, and they all have different. Many of them have different relationships with their Indigenous people. So we've kept it fairly high level, but it's recognition, particularly for us, of the rights of our Indigenous people. As I say, we went back and we discussed early on the fact that we wanted to negotiate. We would do all we could to uphold the constitutional rights that we now have to adhere to within our own country. But as we engage with the UK and the EU, we have to follow those through. So intellectual property, a cultural significant, the jewels of the Māori culture have to be recognised. And so when it comes to IP protection, we have to make a special effort that they aren't just part of what we would call a normal commercial trade agreement. They have additional protections.
What do you think about trying to get these issues, the protection and advancement of Indigenous businesses, into more trade agreements, into more trade negotiations? Is it fair to say currently it's not common to have these issues raised in a trade agreement? And what do you think is the opportunity there? You want to maybe jump into that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the most important, strategic agenda in our country is to opening up the economy. So we are signing, or negotiating 10 new free trade agreements during this government. We already started, we're just close to negotiations with Costa Rica and China in the last months. We are starting one with Canada, Panama, the Dominican Republic, Israel, and other countries, South Korea as well. And in the only free trade agreement that we have discussed Indigenous people rights, and trade is with Canada. And we're really happy to do it because I think those are the things that were not really common in the economic and development discussions, and especially in trade agreements, and that's something that we need to include. So gender equality, financial inclusion, social inclusion, but the inclusion of Indigenous related trade agenda is something really important.
And to Fawn's earlier point, are you bringing in the Indigenous people themselves into these trade negotiations?
In the case of Ecuador, yes, we have roundtables with the indigenous leaders, but also with the communities, because usually when you talk about free trade agreements, especially in Ecuador, it's the indigenous people and the indigenous leaders that are against those trade agreements. But as we have seen in the case of the European Union agreement that we have in Ecuador, the indigenous communities and producers are the ones that are being more benefited by these agreements, because they produce the things and the products that are being exported by large companies, of course, but they produce those.
I mean, I think it's really important that fora like this, that we front these issues. And I think as chair of APEC in 2021, we included and made reference and have set up what's an open plurilateral agreement. It's Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement, IPECTCA. It's a mouthful, but what it is a framework for all of us to come together and to address these issues and to help one another and how we learn. We were challenged by our Indigenous people over one of our trade agreements, and their issue was upheld by the tribunal to say that we hadn't fully considered their Indigenous rights in negotiating CPTPP. And so for future trade agreements, we'll make sure that they are more actively involved, that we protect those rights.
Is that happening for you, Aslak, your community, the Sami, across, of course, 4 different countries? Do you find when trade agreements are being negotiated, you're being brought to the table?
No, absolutely not. So there is a lot to learn, and perhaps there could be some exchange of best practices. But as I was talking about the challenges of cross-border trade, then not much has happened there yet.
So trade agreements, of course, themselves are very important, but what are some of the other initiatives, other programs you want to see happen? Maybe Fawn, you can begin.
Yes, sure. So you'd mentioned access to capital, and that's something that we're very interested in. I think the world knows Indigenous peoples are on the front lines of climate change. We're disproportionately impacted, and we have little to no resources. And so in the United States, with the Inflation Reduction Act, 500 is it billion? Yes, was set aside. Tribal nations, when you divide $500 million, 500 million among 574 tribal nations, it's less than $1 million a tribe. And so when you have tribes that are facing sea level rise and just the global scale of impacts, that's hardly anything. And that was a large-scale investment in the United States. And so we are actively looking. You've heard John Kerry say, what do we need? We need more money, 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 right? And so from our perspective, we know that there's an opportunity for public-private partnerships. We know that corporations are now being sued by their shareholders for not managing investment with an eye toward climate risk. The NASDAQ has an index now on climate risk. And so we want to provide an opportunity and position tribal nations where if you invest in tribal nations in our sustainability plans, you could take that to the bank. It's going to be a gold standard. We're going to repatriate our lands. We're going to restore salmon. We're going to value water as a sacred resource. And so as the world continues to confront the threat of climate change, as it intensifies and all these investments are going to play out, we want to set ourselves apart to be able to ensure there's a very tight nexus between the precious few dollars and actually making a difference on the ground. We're directly engaging with colleges and universities to provide qualitative and quantitative data so that we could verify those results. And so we want to just position ourselves to be ready to deploy massive investment into Indian country and to make a difference and to be part of the solution.
I'm going to go to questions in just a minute, so get prepared. But it seems like you're saying, on the one hand, yes, there's financing opportunities that we have to address for individual businesses, but there's a bigger market issue here.
That's right.
That, of course, there are carbon credit markets that are growing around the world, and that the indigenous communities in the U.S. and elsewhere could play a really special role in that. If you're going to value carbon credits or value preservation of biodiversity, that actually what matters a lot, as you've seen, is the standards, because there's many people selling credits. When you actually look, you find they're not really protecting the forests or the land.
That's right.
And so there's a value there if we can really get it verified. And that could be a big opportunity for Indigenous people.
Absolutely. And there's also the intermediary. So right now, in large part, there are NGOs and others who purport to secure funding and to make a difference, but sometimes we find they act against our interests, and that's a problem. And so we know we have a genuine and authentic role in this space, and it's valuable, and we want to ensure that every precious dollar that is invested and spent on Indigenous peoples is managed by us.
That's interesting to hear. Yeah, so NGOs might have the same broad mission or perspective, but in the end, sometimes their control is more important, and you want control.
And they're disconnected from our community.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay,
good to hear. Aslak, any other points on this, like beyond trade agreements, any other initiatives or programs you want to make sure are on the agenda?
Yeah, I want to highlight our work with intellectual property rights. So, as I said, there is a lot of interest in Sami culture, in Sami products, Sami design, handicrafts, which we call tuetti. So we have just recently launched 2 trademarks. With this, we want to both be able to offer authentic Sami products and protect our traditional design. So we have launched a trademark on Sami tuetti, so the traditional handicrafts, which will prove to the buyer that this is what we consider our traditional handicrafts product, and it is made by a Sami with traditional methods. Then we launched another trademark, which is called Sami Made, which means that this product is offered by a Sami or Sami majority owned company. So they can be modern design, they can be, let's say, t-shirts or whatever, but it means that it is something that the Sami has made and offers. So by this we want to be able to tell the buyers that this is actually Sami product, and if you want to support our companies, our culture, then this is a sign that proves you're doing so by buying this.
And certainly you're doing this for the future, but in terms of the present, are there lots of people going around the Sami community developing these copy products and selling them?
Yeah, I mean, one reason why we engaged in this work is because there is quite a lot of appropriation or misappropriation of our culture, and there are a lot of fake products that are being sold as a Sami product. So we wanted to, as a response to this, to be able to offer the authentic alternative. So definitely this is a response to misappropriation.
Okay.
And this is one of the areas that we enforced or included in our trade agreements with the EU and the UK, and acknowledgement of a traditional dance, which is the haka, that you may have seen, and to ensure that it is not misappropriated, misused, and that it is respected in both the UK and the EU. And so our trade agreement has actually given some legal force to that.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to go to questions here in the audience. We have one in the front. Anybody else have a question? Maybe we'll take more than one if we do. We'll start with you. Go ahead. Please just, if you can, stand and tell us who you are as you ask the question, just for the live streaming audience.
I'll stand and take my notes with me. But yeah, I know some of you, but I'm Harmony from Alaska. And I was just trying to bring like an Alaskan perspective into this conversation. And we have a different land claims agreement that we all got paid for the lands that were taken from us. And then I also want to say that I'm from Naknek Native Village. I'm from the Bristol Bay region. And so we were able to form corporations that are with our Native people based on our Native values. So I'm, sorry, I got a little nervous when I was standing up now.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
But yeah, I think that being affiliated with a Native corporation has given me a lot of power, like as terms of scholarships, investment in our Salmon First campaign to protect against mining development in my region. So I'm just wondering if that's a possible model to give capital in the hands of our Native people and have the power switched in that kind of corporate relationship.
Thank you. So you bring in the issue of land claims, obviously a very controversial question, I would think, in many parts of the world. You talked a little bit about it in your case, Aslak, where the wind farms presumably were going to be being put on land that is Sami. How do you think about this issue of land claims and getting compensated? How does it play out in different contexts?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky issue, and I think the compensation should happen only when there is an agreement reached with the community whose territory it is. And yeah, this is quite different approach to that what we have in the Nordic countries. So at least currently the recognized rights are more linked to the cultural rights. So definitely no corporation structure, but perhaps some kind of traditional governance of a certain area and making sure that our rights to use those areas in accordance to our traditions are not hindered too much. So that's more of the approach.
And it sounds like you want to make sure there aren't individual deals made with individual families or something. It has to be the community as a whole.
Yes, definitely. That's something that has to be emphasized, that when we're talking about common lands, then it is not up for individuals to make the decision, because a relatively small percentage of our lands are privately owned, so they're community lands, or in many cases claimed by the state, but still it's the community that uses them, and it has to be a collective decision.
How do these issues play out in other contexts? Go ahead, Damien.
I mean, we set up, as I say, we had the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840. We made commitments to our Māori people to protect their rights and their land, and you know, through time, those weren't always honoured. And so we set up a tribunal where individual groups of Māori can lay claim to their right to land that might have been taken or might have been displaced. May have been displaced from that, and we are still working through that. And so there's an active assessment of those rights, and often it is land is given back, or we give government land back to them as compensation, sometimes with money. To actually rectify clearly what were wrongs of the past. And it's been, some say, you know, a very lengthy process that should finish. We say it has to conclude in a way that is fair to our Māori people.
Do either of you want to go ahead, Helga?
Yeah, well, our constitution mandates that any type of private investments in the indigenous lands recognized by the constitution has to go through what we call a previous consultation in those areas for any type of investment, private investment. Of course, this is related to oil, gas, mining, but other type of investments. It's a good thing. It protects the indigenous lands. On the other hand, it hinders, of course, any type of investments in those areas. So there's always a struggle between private investments, you know, and protecting the cultural rights and the lands of indigenous people, especially in the rainforest, in the Amazon. So we do have those struggles all the time. I'm no expert, so I don't want to go into that field because it's really complicated. Yeah.
Yes.
Fawn, anything you want to add to this?
Yes, I think just when you look at the citizenry in the United States, there are issues of consultation rights. And so tribal governments, of course, have consultation rights. The corporations have consultation rights over lands questions. And so there's the issue of what happens if in a consultation session, a tribal government takes one position and a corporation another. How is that resolved, that conflicts? And so that's a significant issue that when you look at the inherent right of tribal nations to have a decisive say, that's a governing function and that's a political question. And when you get in the mix of business questions, does that undermine our inherent sovereignty that could then undermine our governing authorities in other areas? So that's something we're always mindful of as well.
Interesting. Let's see if there's any other questions here. And if we don't have any other questions, I'll come back to the panel and just say, what do you think is missing? So we've had, you're here at a forum with business leaders, government leaders, and nonprofit leaders. To what extent do you find when you're interacting with them, this is new information for them, or they are already in some way engaging on these issues of indigenous business, indigenous rights?
Go ahead. Oh.
Yeah, I've gotten some reactions that these are new things.
Yes.
People are not familiar with, for example, the impacts of the green shift and the wind power development case, that it might be having negative impacts to communities. So I think definitely there is a need to build the knowledge basis for the audience that we've met here, and yeah, I think it's also part of the work that we're doing to make sure that on the national level there would be sufficient recognition of our rights, because as I see it, it would also bring stability to outside investors, because at the moment, if there is insecurity regarding the cultural rights and land rights and what is the actual limit that you cannot cross, then I think there is definitely work to be done there, and it's part of the same job here to raise these issues in the international forum.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, David.
I mean, I think trade has been seen traditionally in I guess, the standard economic kind of assessment way of opportunities for growth. And of course, we've measured that in fiscal and monetary terms. But now we're talking about sustainability and the pressures that were brought upon the planet. And so if we're looking for sustainability into the future, perhaps we can look behind and see what gave us sustainability in the past. And many of those lessons come from our Indigenous people. They worked on sustainable systems to look after themselves, to move forward, to live within their environment. And of course, we've had rapid economic growth, and it's been assisted by a fora like this, where we're cooperating, we're trading, and that's good, but we've kind of reaching the limits in some areas. And so I think we have to look back to some of the lessons and some of the values from our Indigenous people and incorporate them into the future. And from a trade perspective, we in New Zealand have a trade for all agenda, which says that we can't negotiate trade opportunities just for a few. It has to be for all New Zealanders. And that means we have a legal obligation to go out and speak to not just Indigenous people, to women, to small, medium enterprises, and to all the people in our economy. And that way we get buy-in to growth, which is sustainable growth, and opportunities for everyone.
Did you want to add something as well?
Yeah, so yes, I would have deferred there. I think it's going to be my experience so far. This is my first World Economic Forum, and the conversations I've had have been very wide-ranging and interesting. So I think the common thing that my takeaway is, one, the conversations, people have been very respectful, knowing that this is an area, it's new to the World Economic Forum. There's some misunderstandings, but they have questions. And then I think they're surprised at the opportunities and the wealth of information that we bring to the table. And so to have some misconceptions clarified, and then to experience and share our vision and the value that we bring, it's a takeaway. And so I've walked away from conversations where people want to learn more, and they want to figure out how they could work with us. And they're thinking, I just had a conversation with somebody around the arts, and they were talking about different ways of looking at their art from an Indigenous perspective, and they had never thought of that before. And so I thought that was really interesting. And so I've just really found it to be very energizing. I'm looking forward to opening up additional conversations. And as we do explore new opportunities that are on the horizon, and the competitive advantage and other advantages that tribal nations bring, I'm just excited to see how this one moment that we've seized, how that multiplies in a million different directions to bring a great deal of information back.
And what about specifically for global businesses, which is obviously a big part of the community that gathers here? If you were talking with the CEO of a major corporation, what would you want that CEO to know that maybe would change their perspective on these issues?
Yes, the thing that I've found to be very valuable for business CEOs is they're trying to figure out things. I had a conversation with somebody from Dow Industries at my very first conference of parties in Poznan, Poland, and they were trying to model, clean water systems. And I said, if you want to see a clean water system, I invite you to come out to the Quinault Nation. You could see from glacier to ocean with no development. And so those are the type of conversations that I've found have been very valuable. And to know that it's one thing to take Indigenous leaders and engage in the business community, but to open up our traditional lands and invite CEOs out to Indian country to see from our perspective on the ground how we effectively manage our lands and resources in a way that provides a new value. I think everybody sees on the horizon a new economy. What does that new economy look like that's sustainable? I think it would be a very valuable lesson for CEOs to come out and visit. So I'm going to be open to inviting two-way conversations for us to come here, but more importantly, and just as importantly, for them to come out and learn from us on the ground.
That sounds like a fantastic opportunity. Earlier Fawn mentioned the nonprofits in the United States and this issue of control. Part of our audience at Devex, the core of our audience, are development professionals. People work at international NGOs, the UN, the World Bank, et cetera. What do you think they need to know when it comes to supporting development efforts in countries like Ecuador, low, middle-income countries, when it comes to the Indigenous people there? Anything, Julio, that comes to mind for you?
Yes. Well, I think, first of all, I was discussing with a couple of colleagues from the World Economic Forum outside before coming here about which are the projects, international projects of cooperation related to indigenous small and medium enterprises or indigenous cooperatives, for that matter. And we couldn't find a lot of those. So I think we have to have a deeper focus on indigenous trade, on indigenous, productivity and ways of production. So in Ecuador, this is not a new topic. We have been discussing this for the last probably 50 years in our country. But at this very same moment, this is a very sensitive topic because we have had 2 consecutive years of social unrest led by indigenous leaders. And they would try to overthrow the government. So it's really important to sit and to have these really deep conversations. And for the first time in 200 years, we sat together for 3 months and we discussed things related to water, mining, indigenous rights, productions, free trade agreements. So we had different tables of discussions. They were not easy. I was in some of those tables related to investment, to trade openness, to ways of production, to prices, control prices, and everything. But for the very first time, we managed to understand each other and to have conversations. So I think for the business leaders from all over the world, it's really important after the pandemic, as I said, to understand that indigenous communities and indigenous products might be what you are looking for because they are sustainable, they are organic, they are free of pollution, of contaminants. So this is really going back to basics, we are really looking forward to do now in the world.
And what about the international NGO community or the World Bank, the UN? When you think of the international organizations, are they further than the business community is? Do you think they're understanding these issues and seeing the opportunity there?
To be honest, I think they are not really understanding what really is driving the indigenous communities, at least in Latin America. It's not only them. I think the whole world and the whole stakeholders in the world, the business community needs to understand better the situation.
David?
I think, and we have to acknowledge that we're talking about it here. That's a great start. As I say, we've raised it at APEC, OECD, all the international fora that are looking for a better future have to incorporate not only the rights, but the opportunities and the wisdom from our Indigenous people who, as I say, have sustainably got us often to where we are. We've had, periods of rapid growth now. We just have to take stock. Particularly post-pandemic, we've learned a lot, the importance of people. We've got a different situation often with unemployment, with inflation. So new challenges ahead, and we can't move forward and leave our Indigenous people behind. They have to be part of that future.
I think we're running down to our final minutes here. So Aslak, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Perhaps just a bit of a different kind of approach to a different kind of global company and cooperation, also related to intellectual property rights. So I just want to highlight one successful case where we approached Disney because they were using Sami culture as inspiration to a well-known Frozen animation film. After the first film, we approached them and we stated that you are clearly using our intellectual property. Only way to use it correctly is by cooperating with us. And we managed to establish a communication, and Sami Council as a civil society representative and the Sami parliaments as governmental bodies, we cooperated with Disney. And long story short, but we ended up with a product that is respectful to Sami culture. It presents our cultural property in a way that we appreciate, and it brought value to our community, both visibility and we got some capacity through the Disney internship with them. So I think this is a good example of how this interest to indigenous cultures can be made into something positive and lifted.
It's a great example. The media and content industries are so reliant on many of these traditional stories, yes. And ensuring that there's a connection there is so important. Fawn, any final thoughts from you as we close?
Yes, I just want to take the opportunity just to have an open invitation. Tribal nations and indigenous peoples around the world are eager. We stand ready in partnership. And so there is no dumb question, as people say. If you have an interest, just please reach out and engage with us. We have a lot to offer, and we're here ready to work with everyone that is interested in meeting up with us.
Any very quick final thoughts from either of you?
In my case, just I think this is really important to bring these topics into the mainstream agenda. In my case, trade and investments. I think we can do some deeper focus related trade and investment in the indigenous agenda. So that's really important. Yeah.
And look, we just welcome the opportunity to participate. We've a lot to learn. We've a lot to share, and I think it's through international fora like this that actually we can see real growth and improvement in the lives of many Indigenous people, because they have, through colonisation or through normal economic growth, they have been disadvantaged because of the structures that don't always fit into, what we accept as the norm. But I think those things are ready for some change. For like this are the places that we can insert in the rights and the opportunities for Indigenous people.
That's a great point as we close. That, there's a long history here. A lot of it's painful, but we are in a different moment now, and there's an opportunity inherent in that moment. We're entering a new era, a different kind of business, a multi-stakeholder capitalism approach, a sustainable approach, in part because we have no choice.
That's right.
The planet is telling us we have no choice.
Right.
And so if we can seize this opportunity, there's a lot we can do. So we're delighted to help bring this topic here to the World Economic Forum stage. And I want to hope you'll all join me in thanking this fantastic panel.